Kia ora he uri tēnei o Te Atiawa me Taranaki, ko Alice Tupuna Samavula Ho. I teach at the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, and one of the great joys of the last 3 years of my life has been a Marsden funded project called Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts 1900 to 1975. The project spends time going all around the region, 1900 to 1975, a period that we actually don't know that much about. We spend a lot of time talking about kind of first adventures and connections with Europeans coming into the region, and we talk about more recent things, but particularly in the area of writing and literary studies, which is my own background. It's kind of like what really happened between the end of the kind of contact colonial period and Albert Wendt, like what happened in that time in between. Writing the New World has brought together 16 different Indigenous researchers from all around the region with really different backgrounds and different perspectives and different skills. And the podcast is intended to feature their views, their ideas, their experiences, so that you also can have an opportunity to connect with this writing, but also with the region that it comes from. The whole concept of the podcast is so much that happens at universities, really are things that people beyond the university might be interested in hearing about. We're interested in celebrating the writing from this time period, but also celebrating the work of the amazing researchers that have worked on the project. And so we are hopeful that members of their communities and the members of the communities that produce this writing in the first place would find these podcasts to be interesting, and maybe would have them ask some questions and feel interested in knowing a bit more about the writing of their own communities. In order to contribute to the New Zealand Pacific and Māori Language Weeks, in 2020 a special issue of the podcast is being launched with each of those language weeks, featuring people from those language communities speaking about their research.
Kia ora. This podcast features Ammon Apiata's research on Māori language texts. It is named Tracing a Whakapapa of Māori Spiritual Expression. It also features Ammon's research journey and how he came to engage with this literary taonga. Enjoy.
Kia ora tātou, ko Ammon Apiata tōku nei ingoa, he uri ahau no ngā puhi nui tonu, ngā titoa rangatira me ngā tikoata. Hello everyone, my name is Ammon Apiata, and I am a researcher on the Writing the New World project. And my family come from a place called Matauri Bay in Te Tautukuro in Northland, and I actually grew up in Taranaki though, in New Plymouth, and then when I was my teen years, my family and I moved here to Hamilton, so I sort of feel like I have connections all over the motu at least. I am currently a master's student in the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies here at the University of Waikato, and I have been studying here sort of on and off for the last 8 years. Once I clicked onto the reality that our ancestors were amazing and that they had such a vast wealth of knowledge and their own types of knowledge systems, I just wanted to know everything about it and everything about who they were and who, whose blood I carry in my veins. Like I wanted to know them because I wanted to also know myself. And I think, this was the way for me to do it, was through researching these Māori language texts. And, it's not the only way. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it was a way that I felt comfortable with and that I found exciting and interesting for me as a new researcher, new to research. An interesting way of engaging in a professional discipline and also making it personal to myself. Okay, so the origin of this kaupapa goes back a few years now. So like we had talked before, I was a staff member here at the university prior to enrolling in my master's, and following that year in Te Tohu Paetahi, I had just fallen in love with reading in Māori. So I had, that was one way that I had really strengthened my deal was I was learning in the classroom, and I'd come back home and I'd read any Māori book that I could find. And eventually I made my way to the scriptures. And I was just really interested to see how it read and how they read in Māori. So for myself, like I grew up in church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so I grew up with scriptures, and it was a book that I was familiar enough with scriptures to feel like, okay, I'll be able to draw some not comparisons, but some interesting thoughts about the way that it's been translated. I am looking at Ko te Pukapuka Moromona, which is the Māori translation of the Book of Mormon. There are 2 editions of this book, and the first one was done in 1889, and that was done by, a lot of the work was done by 2 American missionaries, and with the aid of about 4 or 5 Māori, and the Māori really had in that project, the Māori really had the job of editing the work and correcting and just making it as clear and clean, making the reo as clean as possible. And then, almost 30 years later, the decision was made to make a revised translation, and again that was done by a small committee of an American missionary, Matthew Cowley, and 2 Māori, Stuart Meha and Wiremu Takana. And one thing about having 2 editions of the same book and a revised translation is that there are changes and there are differences, and so that creates interesting things to look at in and of itself. So looking at those changes and why those changes were made, and what sort of layers does that add to the interesting use of the language. Both editions of these this translation helped me think about what exactly I want to know. So I am interested in the decisions that were made by the translators, and how they thought best to express spiritual concepts. As a result, the way that I'm sort of structuring my research is I'm pulling out and just a few examples. Obviously, in a master's project, I can't look at the whole, the entirety of like 2 massive texts, but 2 plus massive texts. So I'm just picking out sort of 3 to 5 examples of the way that spiritual concepts have been expressed, and what's the cultural relevance to Māori. And so in the case of religious texts that have been translated, you have cases where there are words that have been repurposed. Their meanings, they might have had a traditional meaning, but then that was sort of similar and sort of equivalent to an idea that was within Christianity, but then not exactly or entirely the same. But then in the context of the scriptures, those words have sort of been repurposed to fit this new context of a Christian gospel. So, for example, things like tapu, something that had a very specific meaning and application in Te Ao Māori, now takes on that sort of further meaning in the scriptures to mean, something that is sacred or holy or set apart or something of God. So those little nuances, but that are either lost or gained in translation, I'm really interested in. You begin looking at very complex concepts to do with people's wairua, to do with people's soul or spirit, and their and their belief systems, their deities, and things like that. And so when I'm talking about spiritual concepts, I'm thinking, how do we talk about God in our language? How do we talk about spiritual practices and rituals and things like that? And how do we talk about this idea of sacredness, or things being separate from the mundane and the everyday things of life? So that's a big part of my work, is looking at how these spiritual concepts are expressed in Te Reo Māori, and bringing them over from one world of like the one Christian context, or the context of like a Christian world, and to another context of Te Ao Māori, or the to be able to express those things in Māori adequately, and to have the same meaning and message transferred.
After introducing his topic, Ammon explains where his research idea emerged from and how he came to refine his thinking.
And I think it's a journey that started for me way before I was enrolled.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But it really is a journey in coming to see the development of an idea and the development of questions that you have about, not just about a text, an Indigenous text, but for me, it all comes back to, I want to know, or I'm interested in understanding more about who our people are and the way that they thought. And I think that for me, that's all of that is locked in these texts. You get to see their way of thinking. You get to see their cultural expression in these Indigenous language texts, and that for me is the ultimate. And so it's taken me a while to sort of get to the point where I can articulate exactly what I am interested in learning. And so like I was saying, I started with an idea, a really rough idea, and just through continuous reading and studying other materials that within the field, I have sort of come to a point where I feel like I sort of know what I'm doing. When I was working in the Auckland Museum, I came across a book that was published in 1915 in the Māori language by Wiremu Takana, so he was one of the three that were involved in the revised translation of Pukapuka Moromona. And so first of all, I didn't know that he had written his own, he had been writing his own stuff, his own works. So I didn't know the book that existed. And then as I began to read the book, I guess I was just so blown away, because a lot of the thoughts that I had been having, about the way that spirituality is expressed across cultures, especially, specifically how Christianity is expressed across cultures. He had written a book about it, essentially. So he had, had his own thoughts about that, Pākehā sort of understand the gospel and the teachings of the church through their own cultural lens. And then he says, sort of laying down not so much an argument, but just a suggestion of like maybe we can draw on our own cultural lens as Māori in order to understand these Christian concepts. And then he goes into drawing parallels between teachings from the whariwānanga, the ancient whariwānanga, which was a practice that, pre-colonial practice of an institution of learning that where tohunga and other learned people from the iwi would come and learn and gain esoteric knowledge and knowledge about the creation of the world and whakapapa. So he sort of advocating on drawing from these old kōrero to try and explain these new Christian concepts that they were presented with. And so because of that, it was just totally blew my mind, because here's him, here he is in 1915 having these thoughts himself,
and having 105 years
later. And then 105 years later I'm sort of having very similar thoughts, but the way that he expressed such a complex understanding of the doctrines of the church, and finding parallels with features and beliefs from Te Ao Māori, it just really blew me away. I know it's probably like the third time that I've said it, but I just found it really amazing, because and even now as I say that, I sort of think to myself, well, I feel bad for even thinking that it was so amazing, because I probably am limiting, how much I think that they would have understood. I don't know. So, even him having the thoughts back then and about, Pākehā understanding things from a Pākehā lens and advocating for, drawing on their own history, on Māori's own history, and understanding things through a Māori lens, I feel like is a very popular concept today in academia, and sort of cultural competency and like cultural relevance and all those kind of things. And here he was sort of doing these things over 100 years ago and throwing these thoughts out 100 years ago. So,
so do you think that's why it's important for Indigenous, and Māori people to do research in Māori language text?
Yeah, I think we understand more about our own intellectual whakapapa too, because we know that, a lot of the thoughts that we have are not new, and just being able to see that we've always been thinkers, we've always been, philosophers, we've always been academics, or, for lack of a better term, we've always been, had a passion for knowledge and for expounding that knowledge to other people. So for me, it was just that, in addition to how relevant it was to my research, it was just really reaffirming to me as well as a Māori that like this is part of our heritage. This is part of our whakapapa, is knowledge seeking. And thinking, For me, I think my answer is not just confined to Indigenous researchers working in Indigenous literature. It's sort of Indigenous researchers working in all facets of academia and everything like that. But my response to the question is, I think it's important that we're telling our own stories, that we, for so long, and I know that it's been talked about by a lot of people before, but, for so long, Indigenous people, we've had our stories told by someone else, someone who is not within our own, community or culture. And I think it's important that we are not just in control of our own narrative, but that we get to decide what stories are told, and think of just my own childhood. Like, I grew up hearing a lot of negative things about Māori. And, you know, for some part of my life, I believed those things. And I had this very warped view of what Māori, who Māori were, who we are, and what our ancestors were like. And it wasn't until I sort of had these opportunities over the last few years to learn that I realised that a lot of these things, well, you know, if not all, were lies, that or just misconceptions that were spread about people who were not us. And I think, you know, in addition to the whakamā keeping me from engaging with my Māoritanga, there was also like that misunderstanding on my part too about, you know, on some level believing those negative things about who we were. So yeah, there's a real life impact on being on having our stories be in someone else's hands.
That's right, absolutely. And this is the good thing about, like you're saying, about in terms of Indigenous people taking care with the love, the attention, the linguistic skills, the cultural understanding. In response to a question posed to Ammon about why it is important for Indigenous people to be conducting research with their communities, Ammon responds.
There's such a wealth of unexplored Indigenous language text that there are more than the current amount of researchers will ever be able to, you know, go through and research and bring back to light. And so there's so much work there for us to do. And I'll bring in an experience that you were there for actually, as you know, going up to we've been doing a bit of like doing a lot of my mahi, and I know your mahi is archival based, and so I've had, you know, experiences and opportunities to work in museums and archives, and just on our recent trip to Auckland, the excitement that we were met with at the Auckland Museum was something that I found both exciting and happy myself, but also really sad on another level, because there was this excitement that there were Indigenous, you know, Māori and Pacific researchers coming to work in the archives, but the excitement was because it was such a rare site, and that to me sort of just feeds into that question that you asked about why we need Indigenous researchers, is because you know, there is already very few of us, and you know, the more the better.
After sharing his research questions, Ammon reflects upon the crucial decision made at a crossroad that ultimately led him on a life-changing journey of self-discovery.
After I'd finished my undergraduate, I actually got a placement in a Spanish high school teaching English. Nice. And so that was a program set up with the Spanish Embassy and the New Zealand government, I believe. And so I was all set to go.
What year was this?
This was 2016, 17.
Okay.
And yeah, I had received my placement, and I just felt really unsettled about the decision, and I just felt like there was something that was not right about it, and that I sort of needed to rethink some things. And I just happened to be speaking with some friends one night, and they mentioned about I think it must have been close to the new year, so we're talking about resolutions and stuff, and if, you know, any of us had any. And one friend mentioned that they had been wanting to learn Māori, and I think hearing that I instantly knew that was it. Like I think things sort of clicked into place where I realized I was going over to Spain to improve and become proficient in someone else's language and culture, and I hadn't really done that with my own. And I had always wanted, since I was young, because I didn't grow up in a Māori speaking home. I didn't grow up sort of immersed in te ao Māori. And so it had always been there, that desire, but I had just not sort of taken those steps to...
So a bit of a wake-up call for you.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call. I knew that the University of Waikato offered a program called Te Tohu Paitahi, which is a full immersion, full year-long course. And basically after that night, the next day, I contacted the Spanish embassy and told them, sorry, I'm not coming anymore, which, like I was saying, not sure if they were upset about, but that's how it happened. And so I told them that I couldn't come. And I think that same day I also enrolled in the course in Te Tohu Paitahi. And
Do you think in retrospect that was the sense of longing that you always carried, and that took a point, almost like a point of crisis, on the verge of going overseas to realise that?
Yeah, I think so. I did think I needed to sort of be presented with this crossroads to know that, to think about my life, because I could have probably happily just gone off to Spain and had a great time. Had a great time.
And then realised later on that I still needed to go back to the marae.
Yeah, exactly. The next year came around, or must have been January, February, because the course runs differently to the university semester. So, I was enrolled in the course, and it was one of the most amazing, enlightening experiences of my life, and definitely one of the best decisions that I've made for my life, that I have no regrets about. And aside from giving me the opportunity to attain my reo, it gave me opportunities to just reconnect with who I am as a Māori, who connect with my Māoritanga. So that was sort of like on a personal level. So because of that year in Te Tohu Paitahi, very intensive study, when I did it was Monday to Friday, 9 till 3 every day for a whole year. And what I got out of it just completely changed the direction of my life, and it set me on a path that I never would have dreamed. I never would have thought it was possible for me to be here right now. So I think I bring it up in the context of me being a researcher now, and me doing my mahi, what I'm doing now, because without that year in Te Tohu Paitahi, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have the ability to do what I'm doing, and I wouldn't have the confidence either. So on a professional level, it has enabled me to, like I said, be enrolled in this master's program in the Faculty of Māori and Indigenous Studies, working with Indigenous language texts, with Māori language texts. And on a personal level, it enabled me to reconnect with my marae, my hapu, and make new connections with other whanaunga and other relations that I never knew that I had, and gave me the confidence to go back to my marae for the first time in nearly 15 years as an adult, and to engage with wānanga that my hapu were holding, and engage with my relations. So it was just The outcomes have been amazing for my life personally. So
And a delightful aroha as well that was received when you finally went home.
Yeah.
And not having the sense of being whakamā.
Yeah.
Like you were saying.
Yeah, so I had so much of those, of just like we were talking about before, the unknown. You know, it's scary, and a lot of the time, Māori, you know, like myself, who grew up in non-Māori speaking environments and not, you know, fully connected to cultural customs and other things like that, there is that whakamā that, and I call it misplaced guilt because it's not our fault, you know, and so it's not our fault that we didn't grow up speaking the language. It's not our fault that we're, you know, somehow disconnected from our, you know, ancestral lands and our marae. So, but it's the fear is really something that is I don't want to say all in our heads, but it's it confined you, it held you back. Yeah, it holds us back.
Yeah.
When really, you know, in my experience in rocking up to my marae for the first time in 15 years and engaging with people there, you know, that was all I received was aroha, and you know, I was very much embraced, and because people knew my whakapapa and knew my grandparents, who our homestead is across the road from our marae, so they knew who I was, but and where I came from, and they knew that I belonged there, but I didn't know that I belonged there. So that was the difference. The difference, and I think that's what this whole journey was about for me, was just finding where I belonged in the Māori world, and I found that because of the decision that I made to do that year in Te Tohu Paitahi. It really gave me the confidence to go back, and knowing that I had reo and that I would be able to understand what was going on, and that I had an understanding of tikanga now. It just gave me that the confidence and the desire to want to go back and engage.
How much exposure and reo did you have?
Yeah, so good question. I pretty much had none.
Wow.
So, I mean, other than the little things that you learn when you're at primary school, you know, you learn sort of tēnā koe and tēnā korua, tēnā koutou, all those things, and maybe kei te pēhea koe, but I'd never... But beyond that, I had not really had any exposure to the language. I guess like anything in life, you get out what you put in. So, you know, a lot of people told me at the start of that year, like, oh, you're just going to come out fluent of this, you know, full immersion, you know, and there's this, I think, a misconception that all you have to do is show up for that kind of class or that type of course, which is, like I said, it's a misconception. It's a lot of work, and like obviously for someone like myself going from, you know, barely any reo to, you know, full immersion, and like you said, now working in Māori language texts, it took a lot of work.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to sort of make it come across like I'm tooting my own horn or anything, but like,
not at all.
Like I said, you get out what you put in. So it is on you as the student to not just go there and be surrounded by the reo, but to bring it home with you.
Yes.
You know, you've got to be trying to train your mind to think differently, to think in another language, and one of the things that I think made my reo go from, you know, I don't know, I don't want to say 0 to 100, but you know what I mean. Which made it just improved it so much was I started reading, you know, that year, and that was by advice from our lecturers. As I started reading Māori language text that I could find. Starting with, early on in the course, I was starting with children's books and just sort of going from there. And it was really cool to see throughout the year the progression of sort of the level of difficulty that I could go to next after I'd finished this book, and I could start this book. And and it was just an opening up to a whole new world of literature. So I've always loved reading. And to see the art form of writing in a different language just expands your mind even more. And so I think that was one thing that helped me obviously not only gain the confidence but gain the ability to read and write in Māori myself. And when you think about it, that's what when new entrants, school children are starting school, that's their first skill that they learned is, reading and writing, and they bring home books to read, and, that's one of those fundamental skills when learning a language properly. So, it just opened my mind, opened my my mind to a whole scope of vocabulary as well, So there was all this learning happening in the classroom, but then I'd go home and I'd try and read and learn even more. The challenges and the fun things. I feel like the fun things I sort of touched on, just seeing the art form of writing in another language, or in your own Indigenous language, and having things sort of make sense, like all of a sudden. So I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this, but even growing up as a young Māori in Aotearoa, but not being able to speak Māori yet as a child, or as an adolescent, I still felt sort of very aware of these cultural ways of being and sort of humour and understanding. Even though I didn't speak the language, you're sort of aware of like the culture that's around you, And so when I got to a point where I could read Māori and understand it, it was like everything made sense, like because you sort of had that last piece of the puzzle, that you could see the full picture now, and so you understand why the culture was the way it was, and why the humour was the way it was, and why. So that was sort of one of the real cool things about mastering that skill of reading in Māori.
Kia ora, Ammon. It's been really a great privilege to have a kōrero with you about your incredible research. I suppose final question is, what message would you like to leave behind for future Indigenous researchers?
Well, having had the opportunity to work in the archives, like I was saying earlier, there is just so much material in there that is just really that has laid untouched for so long, and I think I would hope for the future that I'll continue being able to bring a lot of those early materials back out to light, and to be able to share those with others who are also interested in learning more about the intellectual history of our people. And I also hope, as someone who has now acquired Te Reo Māori and has the ability to create my own records and writings, that I'll use that skill and write myself. So I hope to be able to contribute to the growing body of Māori language literature and Indigenous language text myself.
And I think you've done an amazing job already. Thank you so much, Ammon. Ka pai.
Kia ora, Wanda.